Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. J. David Osborne, the next Swapcast. How you doing?
I'm doing really good. It's afternoon here in Oklahoma. Somebody was weed whacking their lawn, but they stopped, so that's good. But dude, I am stoked to be on. This is my favorite podcast. I'm doing a Swapcast with my favorite podcast.
So you're a big fan of the last Swapcast with Hermetics, right? With James, and that's another one of your favorites. So I decided maybe I just daisy chain through Swapcast now. If someone emails me or messages me and it's like, that Swapcast is really good, I'm like, cool. Do you want to do one? I think this is my new
the model of the future.
Exactly. You get the Rune Soup question, of course, because we'll talk about your podcasts once you give me the weird kid question. But it is a Swapcast. However, I hit the record button on Zoom, so that means I take priority, I think, somehow. David, were you a weird kid?
I was once I hit about 12. So I called my mother and asked her about this yesterday because I couldn't remember. I just sort of remember general kid stuff, being outside, playing with friends. And she said that I wasn't, but that's because she's a sweet lady. But my first real memory of weirdness was when I hit about 12. My dad was in the military, and he got stationed in Germany. And we were in Neubrücke, Germany. And we lived in repurposed German barracks that were around, in the 40s and 30s. And the way that the apartment complex worked was that each apartment was about 4 rooms unless you lived on the top floor. And in that case, they broke down the dividing wall and you got one super long apartment complex, like the super long hall, which as a kid I thought was super tight because I could bowl and stuff. But as soon as we moved in, I got really bad vibes because, of course, I picked the room that was as far back as you could possibly get it. And I started waking up with general feelings of dread and noticing that my books had been moved around and things like that. And at a certain point, I was leaving the house with my family once, and I turned around to turn the final light off. And when I looked down the hallway, I saw a ghost floating there, kind of like the the librarian in Ghostbusters.
Yeah, very well.
Like that.
Speaking of traumatic childhood experiences.
When I used to watch Ghostbusters, I used to have to fast forward the very beginning parts. There were 2 things that I would fast forward. It would be that, and in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when Marion falls into the skeleton pit with the snakes and stuff, I couldn't handle that shit as a kid.
So I had to fast forward it for my little brother, and I'd be like, ha ha ha, you're such a chicken. But like, really, I didn't want to see it either. I'm like, should we fast forward? And he says yes. And in my head, I'm like, thank God, we'll fast forward through this.
But yeah, so I saw a ghost standing there in, German soldier, kind of enlisted uniform. And I kind of didn't mention it for a really long time, but that was when the real weirdness started. And then in high school, my friends and I ate a lot of peyote and shit just got weird from there. Peyote and San Pedro, right? So mescaline-based plants. And my peyote experience in my friend Eric's apartment when I was about 20 led to me becoming a very, very weird adult. That kind of kicked off a synchronicity storm that didn't actually end until about 2 years ago. So yeah, I guess I was a weird kid. But I got on pretty well at school and stuff. Like I wasn't alone or anything like that.
No, fair enough. So did you presumably you've had the discussion with at least some family members about, so the place we lived in Germany was haunted, right? Like, are they like, yeah, we saw some shit too? Did you all have one of those family moments where it's like, wow, it was way more haunted than we thought?
Yeah, so it was my brother. So my mom says that there were definitely some weird vibes there. My dad was never there because he was mostly in Bosnia at the time. But when I would talk about that with my brother, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, man, that was the time where I would just hear whispers and voices and stuff." He's like, "I never went past like the fourth room because there was just strange vibes over there," which is interesting because past the fourth room would have been its own apartment at one point, perhaps.
Yeah.
So that in particular, I think, could have been the site of some sort of paranormal happening. But I guess, I've always kind of, I was pretty much an animist since I was a little kid. I've always kind of just thought that things were alive, even, staircases and, trees and trees. Yeah. But yeah, I guess the nature of this question is that as people answer it, they begin to discover that they are a weird kid, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And people are more familiar with podcasts now, but in the first year or so, I mean, this, you've been doing it for a while. If they haven't been on a show before, they get a little bit nervous and they've got their notes ready or whatever. And it's just a nice little trick to go, well, actually, the thing you are both the most expert and least expert on is yourself. And it kind of loosens people up because they can say, oh, yeah, one time I set fire to the rocking horse at a kid's birthday party or whatever. Like, okay, didn't mean it like that, but all right, go off. So here's the thing, because I had some definitely ghostly encounters as a prepubescent or edge of pubescence there, I guess, in your case. But like, I don't know if I compartmentalize. I think I just hit a moment where I'm like, oh, well, that stuff is real. And like you, I did quite good in school, frankly, and wasn't a loner or whatever. But that was kind of was it like that for you? Because you just went from 12 to 20. Was there a moment where it's like, oh, well, I guess, like, obviously it would have been scary at the time, but like after you'd come back from Germany or whatever, it's just like, well, now I'm a kid who knows ghosts are real. Is it sort of like that?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I went through the dark night of the soul for about 6 or 7 years until those peyote experiences, because I was raised Baptist. So I went through the same kind of thing that I think most Baptist kids do, where you just try to, I went to college and I had a professor who was sort of a student of Daniel Dennett. And so he basically, I thought he was like the coolest guy ever. So I was like, yes, this is actually, everything is nothing. This is perfect. Yeah, nothing's alive. This is great. So that led to, the depressed goth teen years. And then it only came back around with the entheogens.
And what was it about that particular peyote experience at Eric's place when you were 20? Was it something that was on it, or was it, as you said, the sink storm? Was it subsequent things that happened?
So this is kind of a long story, but we got time, right?
We got the time.
All right, I'll tell you the whole thing. So I'm at his place. I had just broken up with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. And I basically ate all of this peyote powder, which is really gross. So you basically just put water in it and it becomes kind of the consistency of a slug.
Yeah.
But we put cinnamon on it to make it taste good, which did not work at all.
No?
It was still disgusting. Not real, no. It was like, I almost threw up a few times. But basically what happens with a bag of crushed up San Pedro cactus, I kept saying peyote, but it was San Pedro, is that the mescaline is not evenly distributed within the powder. So my friends didn't get that much off of it, but I think I got the mega dose. So this was Eric's first apartment. So, 20-year-old dude, no furniture, nothing. So I'm laying on the floor and he has an overhead projector and he's putting plastic Ziploc bags full of food dye on the overhead projector and looking at that like, well, it's pretty trippy, right? And eventually everybody goes to bed and my eyes kind of snap open and I see these two like gray aliens standing in the room with me. And I start getting these telepathic messages from the aliens about basically my life situation and how I need to get everything correct. Like I need to fix stuff in my life or it's not going to be right. So they show me something called the weapon of the apocalypse, which is just these three shapes. It's kind of a dot, a U, and then a kind of like a little bridge type shape. And of course, in the trip, this is, 4-dimensional, amazing, crazy stuff. But when I woke up the next day and tried to show my friends the picture, it was just these three shapes. And so everybody had a good, laugh about that. Like, oh yeah, man, the aliens really showed you something there, right? So I kind of continue my fuckery. And eventually after, growing up a little bit and, begging my girlfriend, then wife now, for forgiveness, she took me back and we started building a life together. And we were going to take a trip to Seoul in South Korea back in the beautiful days when you could do stuff like that. And so when we were planning our trip, I got this thought in my head, and it was just these two words. It was chun chun, right? And I don't know if you do dumb couple stuff with your partner, but I just started saying chun chun to everything that she would say. I don't know, I thought it was funny at the time. So we're planning this trip, and we're kind of looking around at where we want to go. And at the time, I'd been writing a short story about this mime that can kill people by using, like invisible weapons. So it'll kind of be dragging around a mallet or something like that, and it'll swing, and then the person's head will explode. It's a lot of fun. But we're looking around, and she says, hey, come look at this. And right when we're going to be in Korea, there is going to be a mime festival at a place called Chuncheon, right? So I said, well, we have to go to that. Like, that's a sign. So we go to Chuncheon, we go to the mime festival, and it's kind of lame, actually. We see a few...
A mime festival is lame. Carry
so,
on.
But the Chuncheon's like this small little town outside of Seoul. And, there were all these French people around, but it was an actual mime school. So Chuncheon has a mime school there. And all the flyers and like the symbol for the school was the weapon of the apocalypse. It was the exact shape, the circle, the U, and then the bridge, right? And it actually kind of looks like a little stick figure, like raising its hands up. So I took that as a kind of time loop thing, right? Where I was kind of sending myself a message back, because when we had gone to Korea, that was when everything sort of finally settled down in our relationship. So yeah, I just took that as kind of as a closed loop, right?
Sure. So have you worked out why it's the weapon of the apocalypse? Like,
No, no. Well, I mean, who knows? I mean, like right after that, we came back and about 2 years later, the apocalypse is kind of happening, I guess. A sort of apocalypse. So honestly, no, I don't know. I don't know. It's possible too that when I was kind of hearing these voices, I misinterpreted or
well,
something.
I just wonder, like, because there's something exquisitely correct about this, that the art of mime, it might be what they were referring to, because that's the weapon of the apocalypse. So
It's shutting the fuck up.
Well, kind of, but also playing with the real and the unreal. And it's so there's sort of a kind of, there's just a game aspect to it, and an annoying French game. Reality is an annoying French game.
Well, yeah, I would
think that. Like, I think there's something to sit with on, if the weapon of the apocalypse is some iconography pointing at a school of mime. Maybe it'll continue to unpack.
Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Go for it.
I know that you just finished a new book. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Well, I actually haven't finished it. We have just announced it.
Oh my goodness! Oh yeah. Boy, that's troublesome, sir.
It is. But what I was joking, well, not joking, but when we were arranging the timing for it, I said to Peter and Akistis, if you guys don't announce it, I actually won't finish it. Like, it's at that level. I'm not like, well, I think I might write a book. Like, I've been fucking with it for about 18 months now, but now this is the summer where it turns itself into a book correctly. My summer, not your summer. And yeah, so it's announced. It's mostly done, but it's not done.
Well, that's my question. So you blog prolifically, pretty much. I mean, like the last few blogs that you've done have been what, 10,000 words each?
Yeah, and they take a week each time. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is it about the blogging that seems to just kind of roll off, your fingers basically, versus the book that's taken 18 months?
The book is the book required some adventures that hadn't happened yet. So it is an exploration of animism as we've been exploring it with premium members and on various shows and so on. But because it's that, it has to be explored in the context of epistemologies or ways of validating truth that are either phenomenological or at least experiential. So that was mostly why. And the adventures have happened. Well, there's actually one left to go. But that was, the book is a story that is based in things that have happened in the book wrote itself by me doing things, essentially. Now, blogs or blog posts are different to that. And weirdly, as the writing and the planning and whatever for the book started to scale up, so did the compulsion to actually do long form blog posts again. Because before it's sort of, and it's true, and when we're doing a podcast now, I love podcasts and so on, but there's just something about something utopian or now, because it's so long ago, like a decade or so, bittersweet and enjoyable about sitting somewhere like a cafe or a pub and opening up the laptop and tapping out an old-timey blog post. Like it's almost quaint. And I think it's I think they're coming back. I think people are reading more and more of these things. There's some sort of hybrid form of AV in the sense of podcasts and video and whatever, and actual blog posts coming back. I think as what passes for mainstream media collapses under its own idiocy, there's something additionally authentic about the blog post form. But it turns out I can't write books without also writing blog posts. And I kind of get that, because I have questions for you about writing and its importance and so on. But I get that. I get that if you are in a writing phase, almost like in an embodied sense, like if many of your hours of the day are tappity, 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 the mind can get tired, but it's the fingers still want to type. So what I like about doing multiple projects at once, like a book and blog post that take a week or so, is that you sort of tap out on one writing project at like the 3-hour mark, like that is enough. But actually I can keep going on a complete, like your mind is full again if you move to another topic, and that I quite like.
Right. Well, that's, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was just kind of wondering about that. So basically, you have this, what is the kind of general idea of the book? Wait, is that bad juju to talk about that? I don't know.
Well, the book's called Animistic, so it is going to be a presentation of a 21st century quote unquote Western animism. So it's the imaginal, spirit, and embodied tools and positions for that. So it's the ways of thinking rather than the products of thought, which we spent a lot of time with. So that's the book. But yeah, I wouldn't say more than that at this stage, because yes, too superstitious.
Oh, dude, I have screwed myself so many times by even tweeting about things that are going to happen. I don't know why, but my life just sort of works that way. If I tell anybody that I have anything cooking, even if it's 3/4 of the way done, if I say something, my brain does that immediate thing where it's like, oh, good, you did it. You're done. You got the little dopamine hits. You're good. We're good to go. Yeah, we can move on to the next thing now. I'm like, wait, no, not quite.
Yeah, and the superstition around the sharing before it's done isn't an expectation that someone will steal from you, right? But it just kind of messes with it. It just messes with reality. Like it fucks with your own flow, and also, I don't know, it just doesn't seem right. It's strange.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like it's basically, I think, just validating what you do before you actually have the thing finished, which is a big, I mean, that's an even larger problem with social media in general. I mean, you can extend that not even from writing, but if you say, for example, like, I'm going to paint my house or something, then you kind of don't feel like painting the house because everybody told you, oh yeah, that seems like a good idea. And it seeming like a good idea is pretty much on par with the idea of doing it itself. Like, we make no real distinction between those two things anymore.
Cognitively, we can't observe the difference when you actually like look at brain scans. But I think there's something gnostically correct about what you're saying, which is we have at this moment lost completely the ability. And we're going to be speaking about the invisibles. It's that kind of like when Sir Miles is interrogating King Mob. And he makes him think that his fingers have been cut off, but it's actually just in his mind, and it's little bits of paper that say finger, and he's dropping them on the ground, and it's not his finger. And there's that playing with, we can't tell the difference between this sort of archonic digital messaging and the real thing, and like we literally can't as organisms do that, which is why, especially at the moment, social media gets so dangerous, because if your brain reacts to people saying bad things about you in the same way as if you're being physically assaulted. And it also does that when you say bad things about you in your own head. So it's fucked up. Like Twitter causes brain violence. Like it
really fucking does. It does, dude. That's 100% true. I think brain violence is the best way to think of Twitter, because I was even thinking of it in terms of the schizophrenic, scattered nature. I don't think that we're supposed to see so many disparate thoughts and arguments and counter arguments and narratives and counter narratives all within, a minute and 30 as soon as you wake up. I almost tweeted something mean at a big author today, but then I realized that I had messed up because I turned my phone on as soon as I woke up, and I'd been so good for a week. I had been good. I hadn't been touching it, but I just absentmindedly flicked on Twitter and I saw, somebody saying something dumb, and it's the fight or flight. I have to go get him. I have to correct this error.
Yeah. And the other thing that's coming in with the brain damage is being in a perpetual state of fear permanently alters electrochemical routes in the brain. So this year has given us brain damage, which we are treating by spending a lot of time on Twitter. Now that is just
Oh my God.
Be more wrong. Right?
Oh my God. I know. You know what really kills my soul? Because you expect the archonic forces that rule the world to lie to you and try to make you afraid. Also another point of the invisibles. So you expect that. You expect people like Tony Fauci. And who's that WHO guy? That gangster guy? I forget his name now. But anyway, you expect that. But what really kills me is when I'm walking my dog outside and I see somebody who's about my age, so I'm in my early 30s, riding a bicycle, wearing a mask, because that means the brain virus has taken hold. Because there's no world, even if you have completely swallowed hook, line, and sinker the narrative that's been given to us, that the mask being on while you're riding a bicycle outside in the summer in Oklahoma, these people have taken this next step. Like it's got its claws in deep.
And I don't think anyone comes back from it, because we were DMing about some people sharing heartbreaking tweets about things like my sister's still putting on gloves and washing groceries when they bring them into the house. And this is in Britain, where I think the latest numbers were something like you have a 1 in 2 million chance of dying from this collection of symptoms that has a name. I'm trying to be like, I'm trying to use the word less and less on shows that end up on YouTube.
Oh, that's really smart. That's really smart. Yeah. Rest in peace to Dell.
Yeah, exactly. So we're kind of talking about like narrative, because I think the narrative, as you say, even if you buy it, which is just impossible now, like because the official version has changed however many times it needs to perpetuate the the great resetting that we're living through. So even if you somehow manage to get all of that in your head as a coherent narrative that you believe, which I don't think anyone does, it is just a delivery mechanism for the fear. That's the bit you look at and go, this is a delivery mechanism for fear. And I'm not sure how people are going to walk themselves back from it. I don't know how, if here we are in early to mid-September, and if you're still washing cans that have come from the supermarket while wearing gloves before you put them in your house, how do you come back from that?
You don't. That's the problem. Well, I mean, there is stuff like CBT that can maybe work for people. I think if you're an OCD doctor, you're about to have a huge influx of clients. But all CBT really is when it comes to OCD is ignoring it until people are ready to ignore the thing. I mean, I just saved people potentially, tens of thousands of dollars for getting a counselor. All they really tell you to do is ignore it and just get through it. But until people are ready to do that, do you think that people like to be afraid?
I think it's deeper than that. I think they're afraid that how they see the world isn't right. And that's how a lot of this works, because I'm telling you, in the back of everyone's head by now, I mean, we can chuff a little bit about being reasonably correct the whole way through this, but by now, even in the people washing groceries, they know something isn't right about it. And that's the fear, because you now have to live in a world where, but like presidents and things are telling me this stuff. And so you have to live in a world where you have to live in a world where that is a reality. And most people haven't faced that. And they've had to face that at the same time as a health incident that has affected some people. So that, I think people, I don't know if they necessarily like fear. I think what's happening here is it's fear is better or preferable. Being in fear is better or preferable than the bigger fear, which is having to dramatically update how they see the world, possibly for the worse. I mean, I don't think it is, because invisibles, but possibly for the worse. And I think I do think there are people coming back to the idea of this being the same kind of digital control archon that we see explored perfectly in the invisibles. I do think there are people who enjoy or take pleasure in the application of state violence because they agree with it. That's really dark. I think people like that. I think people like. I think enough people have to like tyranny for it to work. And again, going back to Twitter, you can kind of see that with apparent leftists championing biopolitical state violence, and that is not a left position to really underline it. And I think that's it. I think there's this entity, and even if you just think of it as a collection of ideas and positions, because people don't get that. I use technocracy all the time when I'm talking about it, and I mean it quite literally as an ideology. It used to have a magazine, like in the 1930s there were like technocracy magazines and conferences and so on. Like, it is a specific set of principles that is applying managerialism to human behavioral change. Like, it had proponents and magazines and things. When I say it, I mean it quite literally. And even if you want to quote unquote just consider that a metaphor, or like the idea that ideas have people rather than people having ideas as a metaphor, you can look at that as an entity, and you should, because you get a reframing and repositioning of how to be in the world when you can see that as something like the king of all tears in the Invisibles. And because these books or these graphic novels are essentially perfect, there's repeated descriptions of how these entities breach into our world. And it's sort of like their human acolytes create the bacterial conditions for them to be able to kind of geometrize down into our experience of them. And that's literally the 20th century, right? So even if you want to just use it as an unhaunted metaphor, it's a useful one.
totally agree. Yeah, because that's sort of how reading The Invisibles again. So the last time that I read it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, which I think was right before I found Rune Soup, and that must have been what made Rune Soup click for me so well, because my brain was kind of there. That had been my second or third read through. For listeners, I'm a Grant Morrison super fan. In fact, I'm such a Grant Morrison super fan that I went to Morrison Con in 2012 in Vegas at the Hard Rock Hotel, which is just awesome. If you're going to go to Vegas, you want to do it as butt rock trashy as you possibly can, and the Hard Rock Hotel is the way to do that.
Is definitely it.
Yeah, it was great, and in a way, it kind of suits Grant.
Yeah, I think
that's kind of his thing, but it was awesome. It was 2 or 3 days, and he would read, poetry while what's that guy's name from My Chemical Romance?
I know the one.
Gerard Way. He would do the music and stuff. And it was cool. It had a cool roster of people. There was pre-canceled James Gunn, and there's another guy who got canceled. A lot of people got canceled who were at Morrison Con. Anyway, so I was basically primed for Rune Soup, because as I was going back through it for this conversation, I was like, oh, this is stuff that Gordon talks about all the time. So you've sort of adopted the Invisibles universe into your lexicon. And when you talk about things like the Archons and the Aeons and the Invisibles and how they how they control everybody through fear, because do you think now's a good time to maybe explain what the Invisibles is for anybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, sure. Let's hear your version of it, and then you can tell us about your tat.
Oh yeah, my tat. Cool. Which tat do you want? The skull smoking a blunt, or the snakes that are trying to eat dollars?
The motorcycle.
Oh, that one. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So the Invisibles came out in 1994. The first issue did, I believe, 1994, and it was about a group of anarchist sort of rebels who were, nonconformists. It was cribbed heavily for a film called The Matrix, which I think a lot of people have seen. So you sort of start off with this kid named Dane who meets this old wizard. I believe it's in an abandoned subway tunnel, and he starts to learn all this cool magic stuff, and he gets introduced to this group of freedom fighters called the Invisibles. And basically, the best way that I could describe it, because the series is so chaotic, literally every 2 or 3 pages, you're flipping to a different time or a different character or some crazy shit that's going on. Essentially, the Invisibles' job is to fight power and control wherever it pops up.
Correct.
And there are these cells all over the place. So there's not one particular bad guy. There's kind of a rotating cast. There's Sir Miles is there through pretty much the whole thing. He's a kind of a British James Bond type, sort of a Bond in retirement, who has now decided to team up with the Archons to bring something called the Moon Child into existence. See how troubled this is? How you can go down so many freaking rabbit holes?
I describe it because he's got the whole Empire Never Ended stuff, and the first issue where Dane meets Tom of Bedlam and so on. They also go back in time and bring the Marquis de Sade to the present, right? So it looks chaotic because it is a description of a continuous battle. So
exactly.
One of the things that I like about it is that it frees you from the myths of despair, but also the myths of your power. So electionism and all this kind of crap that we're stuck with now, like go and fucking vote for Biden, like kill me, my God. But it just removes all of that and makes you realize you are playing in this bit of time a role that has lasted for thousands of years, and it is the being agents for the promotion of life and joy and sex and all that squishy stuff. They literally bring the Marquis de Sade into their version of the present in the first one, and he was or is an invisible. So it puts you in communion with the true freedom fighters of history, and that's really empowering. That's like, oh, I'm actually part of that legacy. And it's not just a legacy, it's because Grant's very good at playing with time. It's not just a legacy, it's they're doing it at the same time we are. And it kind of puts you, so Grant describes this kind of cosmic context, and I think people, if they're not aware of that, because it is, when Chris Knowles was on the show, we're talking about this in some of Alan Moore's books, he's like, it is like drinking from the fire hose. And that's one of the good things about it. Like, if you think you might be interested in chaos magic, well, you aren't until you've read these, but they're actually quite a good thing to start on, because it offers like the most crazy rabbit holes, but it's also, and this is Grant's other power, is he can, I don't use words like fiction and nonfiction because they're products of a broken theory of mind. So I use the word story, but he can write a story that allows you to explore story, and that he does that with Flex Mentalo, but he does that in this, and it gives you again that position on reality that can kind of be that first step into becoming an invisible, I suppose.
Yeah, and Flex Mentalo is a book that I love a lot, but it's kind of held up as this sort of pure distilled Morrison book because it's very short and kind of hits all of his themes very clearly. I think he does it better in The Invisibles, though, because it's so kind of seamlessly integrated into the plot. So at any given time, The Invisibles could be a comic book written by a guy named Kirk Morrison. It could be a novel written by a man named Gideon Stargrave. It could be a novel written by a character named Ragged Robin when she's in college, and she's in this kind of strange float tank made out of living language. So at any given time, you're made to wonder, how deep inside the rabbit hole are you going? That's kind of what makes The Invisibles such a fascinating read, is you feel like it's like an acid trip. So every acid trip that I've ever been on, I feel like I'm going sort of deeper and deeper. And it's like, okay, now I'm hanging out with my friends and we're laughing and this is kind of a good time. And then I'm going outside and, oh, wow, yeah, the grass is really, and then I'm going deeper and I'm like a minstrel in the woods playing a lute, right? And then I'm even deeper and, and I'm back in time and I'm somebody else. Probably the most intense acid trip I ever had was 10 hits with 2 of my friends. And we decided that the way that we were going to drink our beers was to pour them on each other and break all the plants in the house and put the potting soil all over us. So, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I'm in this, a standing inch of beer that's purple and green and all these crazy colors. And then I remember like coming back out of it and we're all standing there in our underwear covered in potting soil. And we were just like, whew, well, boys, we really did it again. And that's kind of what The Invisibles feels like. It feels like sometimes you come up for air and you're sort of in like a quote unquote reality, but then you just go right back down again. It's an acid trip that keeps pulling you down.
And I think one of the things, and maybe the principal thing that anchors it into reality so that it works as an entheogen or whatever, is we're talking about The Invisibles being the comic or graphic novel in your hand, a novel written by this person or that person who's in it, or and so on. But also, because he was young and you could make money in comics at the time, Grant wrote this more or less on the road, like in the sense of traveling around the world and dressing in drag and living in Soho briefly and all that kind of stuff. So he's entangled in it, which you need to do to create a story that is about story and story's implications for reality. And so there's that extra layer of it that allows it to be a portal, right? And I think that is that's its. And because of that, we're DMing over the last few days to talk about it, and you're saying like it's so 2020 relevant, and I'm like, well, it is because it's a spell. He did something. He did this kind of like multi-year ritual by exploring how being and writing story, kind of coming back to animistic actually, by exploring how being and writing are co-implicated in everything, and I think that's why you look at it and go, this is the perfect encapsulation of villains. Because I talk about the archons and so on in the first book. first couple of them, the quote-unquote bad guy, well, there's certainly the bad guys, but the villains are called the conspiracy. And that is perfect because it's the human and more than human together. So it's the humans and the archons. And it is sometimes the humans, and it's sometimes the humans who know they're working for the archons, and it's sometimes the archons. But you have this frame of it where the bad guys are the badness, like technocracy or whatever. And you can call it the conspiracy, and you don't have to do, and this is in fact a shortcoming of conspiracy culture, you don't necessarily have to get the conspiracy war going. And okay, well, he's worshipping this, and that's the Queen's cousin, and so he is in charge of the sheriffs in the US. And I think that, like, when you call it the conspiracy, you actually move into magical language. Like, it's a spell that at least, well, it doesn't contain them, but allows you to see them clearly, because you just need, there's a sufficient amount of detail there, which is both human and archonic. And you don't need to work out, like, is something wearing Fauci or Bill Gates? Like, you don't need that necessarily. And he starts there. I mean, it gets dizzyingly ornate, and I think it's a Gnostic gospel in the sense that no one that I have read, and I've read most Gnostic texts that are available in English, no one has come quite as close as Grant in his descriptions of what archons feel like, but and what they are when they come closer, right? Like, it's astounding.
Yeah,
and you read it, like the sickness and the fact that basically humans fell into despair, and that's what attracted the despairing ones kind of closer to our dimensions, and then this whole thing is exquisite. It's exquisite in its characterization, or correct characterization, of evil. And when I say correct, is it's so you can see it. You can see it, you're 80% of the way to freedom.
Yeah, and the thing about the archons, I want to kind of go back to what you were talking about, the conspiracy and it not being that important, whether or not something's writing Fauci. The thing that the archons sort of want to do is they can't create anything because they exist outside of time. So they can't grow. So what they sort of want to do is to come into our reality and kind of feed it with artificiality. There's literally a character that shows up in book 6 who is a blind guy, right? So it's the literal blind god, right? Who's like coming down to creation. And so they're essentially they hate freedom and people being happy and having fun, because they can't build anything that way. They can only sort of build things out of despair. And that kind of, to me, when you look at the conspiracy that's going on right now, when you look at a character like Bill Gates and you think, well, what is his sort of end game? Well, he doesn't really have one, I guess. And maybe if you asked him, it might be something that in his mind is actually pretty good, but it doesn't matter, because he's part of an archonic force that is an overall net negative for the world, that's going to lead to things like contact tracing and not even health passports, but I mean, what's the next step after that? It's social wellness passports. You see them trying to do that now and say that, racism is a health crisis. Well, who determines who's racist enough to travel, right? Or who's not racist enough to travel?
It's I think, again, this is and I'm, as Tim Dillon would say, by the way, I've got something else to say about him. Like, when he was on Rogan, he's like, look, I'm a conspiracy guy, and that's me to a T. I think people they look at, and by the way, conspiracy is acting in class interest. Like, I wrote a big long post about this, as did Charles Eisenstein, that this used to be a left critique. Like, socialism is officially a conspiracy theory. Like, and I mean that to its credit, because what it is saying is that the predatory class will act in class interest. And that's the whole point of left critiques, is to point that out. And that is definitionally conspiracy, right? Because conspiracy is to breathe together. It's to act in class interest. So when I say it, I mean it like that. And I think on Conspiracy Land, we look at the fact that a big part of what a big part of the funding, if you will, of the Great Reset comes from the amount of money that's going to be made, already is being made in medical insurance, because we've just had half a year where you've had to pay insurance premiums and no one's had any surgery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the actual profits in medical insurance are fucking through the roof in 2020. The other thing, so people are like, oh, he's going to make a whole bunch of money off vaccines, that's why they're doing it. And I'm like, he is going to make a whole bunch of money off vaccines. That's not why they're doing it. This comes back to your point. Like, he thinks he's doing the right thing. He thinks that the world is better under management, and that is technocracy. And it's there, Mr. Quimper, who's probably the most interesting of the villains, or archons.
Certainly the creepiest.
Yeah. Well, he says, when he's explaining in Kissing Mr. Quimper in Volume 2, he's explaining to the Invisibles, you forgot you were parts of a machine, and because of your forgetfulness, the machine is inefficient, and they are there to correct our functioning. So that's technocracy to a T, right? Like, it is looking at the glorious life ways and flourishing in all its ups and downs of mankind, and saying this is inefficient and it needs to be under management. It needs to be under specific scientific machine-like artificial intelligent management to efficientize it, right? And that is the bad guy. And that's why it's really good to sort of keep it quantum as the conspiracy, because you don't need to, it allows you the freedom to conceptualize that however you were ready to conceptualize it, because it is actually a lot more David Icke than people realize. But that doesn't matter. Like, if you can just bracket it as that, it gives you the freedom to be, okay, well, so how do I position myself around it?
Right, and that becomes the problem with any ideology, and that becomes the major problem with Twitter, is that any ideology at its heart has a managerial system behind it that is ready to go. They're locked and loaded, and if only they can get their particular managerial system in place with whatever kind of system of control they want, then the world will be a better place. And that is tricky on both sides, because you want to be against the things in the world that are quote unquote bad. But what I think a lot of people don't get is that the worst thing is that archonic desire to control. And it's tough. It's tough kung fu to learn, you know?
It is, because when people, and this is certainly what control looks like, but when people hear control, they think gulags. They think actual physical application of state violence, like and by the way, we've experienced that. We're actually stuck inside our homes, so that's happened. But control is particularly for technocrats, it's far more elegant than that, and people don't realize when they're doing it. So this is kind of what I was chatting to James about, speaking of Hermetics. Like, Mark Fisher's idea of the vampire's castle is, and how one escapes it, is that even when you think, and you are on the good guy's side if you want there to be things like less racism in the world, obviously, right? However, you're making the world worse if you are violently attacking any experience of differing ethnic or cultural identity outside of this materialist bourgeois formulation that we find on Twitter. But like, that's the vampire's castle thing. It's literally a stealing of it's a stealing from the working class of ideas, and it's done in a way that is archonizable, right? And that's actually its point. It's actually its point that you have these structures, and you can use D'Angeloism to like efficientize the idea of humans from different backgrounds being together in a corporation, and people are promoting this, and you think heart's in the right place, head is literally in hell.
Yeah, I don't think Robin DiAngelo's heart's in the right place. I think that woman is a psychopath.
Well, she's also like, she's deranged and deeply racist herself. Like, but the people who are like, okay, racism exists, let's get some D'Angeloism. Like, that's the bit that's you need something like the conspiracy as a bracket so that you don't fall for that, because that is the conspiracy, that is capital protecting itself, is how I described it to James. But it's the same thing, right? Like, we're dealing with the control grid weaponizing whatever it needs to continue the project of building out the control grid. Like, that's how it works. And
Right.
Grant is all over that, with a description that will melt your face the first time you read it, but also a very, very specific, because it's non-specific, map to freedom and how you correctly fight it.
Yeah, I think in book, so I have the 7 volumes, the trade paperbacks. So it's in Kissing Mr. Quimper. But basically, whenever Fanny, pulls the rug out from Quimper, a lot of this book has to do with the Invisibles essentially setting mind traps for the Archons to get in. I didn't realize how many mind traps there were in this thing, right?
Yeah.
Where you think that the Archons have completely taken over one of the Invisibles' minds, and they kind of have, but it was like that was their bait. Like, they were luring them into their mind to sort of close the walls around them. But Fanny basically tells, I actually took a screenshot of this, but tells Quimper, the darkness in people doesn't frighten me. When you shut your eyes, afraid to see yourself as you truly are, that is when you see only darkness. And I thought that was, there you go. That's perfect. That reminds me of growing up in Oklahoma and having a friend group that was very diverse, and we loved each other, but we were just kind of open and free, and we talked about whatever we wanted to talk about, and we said whatever we wanted to say, and kind of nothing could tear us apart. We're still friends, most of us to this day. And I think that one of the most archonic and insidious things of D'Angeloism is this idea that, it doesn't matter if you're friends with people of color, or, if straight people are friends with gay people, you're still prejudiced in your heart, right? That kind of weird original sin, that thing that needs to be managed. That's the problem right there.
If you are being atomized, you are in the presence of the Archon. It's simple as that. And the D'Angeloist process is an atomizing one. And this is kind of why, as I'm sure you're aware, because we've been through this together, David.
Yes.
That's why this op was so obvious from the beginning, because if you are being atomized, you are in the presence of the Archon. And we have been. And that feeling that you will never, that constant darkness that D'Angeloism puts in like white souls. This is such a fucking race theory. It's just such a mess. But you know what I mean? Again, Entropy in the UK, the description of like it when Dane is first fighting the King of All Tears, he's saying it's not even the fact that they look like these hideous alien demons or anything that's their scariest or cleverest wile. It's they pull to the surface every shitty thing you have ever done and make you feel awful and despair. The exact quote is, "They remind you why you deserve it." And that, by the way, is literally how demons show up when you don't have them on a leash. Like, they're getting closer when that feeling, particularly these kind of demons, when that feeling happens, that they remind you of everything. All you can think about is the worst things you've ever done, and all you can feel is terrible and despair. And they remind you why you deserve it. Again, Twitter, right?
Yeah, right.
That's how I know. That's how I know that this entity is as close to the imaginal surface as it actually is.
Now, speaking of entropy in the UK, this might be shifting gears a little bit. So this is bringing it closer to writing. There is a story that Morrison told often about writing that particular book. So the character of King Mob, who's this sort of awesome badass, he's kind of the main character of the book, was modeled on Grant Morrison. It looks like Grant Morrison. He essentially said that he wanted to write himself into the book and make him like have sex with all the hottest chicks and basically be the coolest guy who ever lived, as a kind of hyper-sigilizing way to make that him in real life, which he is pretty cool, so probably worked. But in Entropy in the UK, King Mob is kidnapped after saving Fanny from, I can't remember the Archon's name, that weird faceless guy. Anyway, so he's basically He's locked up. He's in an interrogation room, and they give him key 17, which messes with his frontal lobe so that he can't tell the difference between words and the actual thing that's happening. Now, when that happens, what Sir Miles does is shows him a mirror with a sticker on it that says diseased face.
Yeah.
So he feels like his face is rotting off. And now in real life, after he wrote that and it went out into the world, Morrison developed a kind of bacterial infection on his face for which he was hospitalized. And so after that, he said, for the rest of the Invisibles, you'll notice nothing really bad happens to King Mob after that. He kind of floats through because he was essentially too freaked out by it. He's like, I put too much of myself into this book. And I was wondering what you think is going on there. What would make it, from a chaos magic perspective, what would make it so that writing yourself as a character in a book, because Stephen King has done this too, and I don't think to any deleterious effects, but what do you think was going on there?
So what you need is a way for that to work, and what you need is an explanation or an understanding for how that works that is the same as how something like New Thought or Sigils work, because it is, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is why the last couple of years I've been so interested in indigenous understandings of metaphor. So Tyson Yunkaporta's example of being at a school that had a whole bunch of indigenous kids who are acting out and what have you, and he gets there and there's this mural on the wall of fish and like representing the kids, and that sounds school and fish and so on, but they're trapped in a net. Like it's sort of they're netted by the beach in this mural, and it's like, what the fuck? This is a terrible metaphor for kids being together. You put them in a net, a prison that ends in their death, right? Mm-hmm. And for indigenous kids, that's a really bad thing to do, because our version of, not that we don't have police violence as well, but our version of that is indigenous deaths in custody, and it's a real problem, right? So that is what Morrison has a metaphor of him that he's exploring magically, and he does bad things to it. And so bad things happen. Like it is honestly as kind of like simple as that. And it kind of comes back to what we were saying before, that your brain can't tell the difference between someone berating you and you thinking bad thoughts about yourself. Like it's the same thing, right? And this is why use of metaphor is so critically important from a magical perspective. Well, having a magical understanding of metaphor is so critically important is a better way of describing it. But you'll write the books and publish the books. Does that stuff not happen to you?
I got really scared about it. One of my novels is pretty much the story of my kind of down and out druggy times in rural Oklahoma. So I did get kind of weird about that, and I was very careful because I knew the Morrison story at this point. I think that I've been pretty safe so far because I do try to have you ever listened to Weird Studies?
Yeah,
it's a good podcast. It's these two dudes who talk about all sorts of different books and stuff. And they were basically talking about whenever they engage with an idea or read something spooky or whatever, whenever they stop doing that, they say, what a bunch of bullshit, which is kind of their way of banishing that. And I do try to keep the writing and the life separate. But basically at this point, I try not to write myself into anything. I feel like that's just like the scariest thing that you can possibly do. I know a ton of writers who, a buddy of mine, really successful guy, but he had a kid and he was terrified of losing the kid. So he wrote a book about a father whose son gets, it's these people on the Amazon, and the son gets like abducted by a shark or something like that and eaten. And it's the father chasing the shark down the river. And I thought to myself, like, that's maybe not the best way to do that. But made him feel better. His kid's fine. So, who knows, maybe.
Yeah, it's not guaranteed, but
right.
Yeah, I think if people do magic and write, they're aware that these are, if not the same thing, somehow kind of the same thing.
Right.
And so you take it with a different kind of seriousness, which is also why I'm so dismayed at people like Neil Gaiman, who should know better, and their shitty theories of mind. But these are the people who are stuck having to kind of sell books to people like us, but also neckbeards and Daniel Dennett types. And so
Alan Moore too. I was so disappointed when I heard Alan Moore say, well, the thing is about magic is that it's just, you're just kind of tricking yourself and working with these ideas. And it hurt my heart. I was like, man, I thought you were cool, but I've always been Team Morrison anyway. But, to kind of talk about the metaphor thing also, at the very end, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't finished it, but it really doesn't matter because it's not the point of the book. But when King Mob faces off against the King of all Tears, he has sort of taken a vow to no longer kill people, because throughout the book, he's a murder machine. He's putting bullets into, all these different soldiers and, whatever. But when he faces off against the King of all Tears, he points his gun at him, and a little clown flag that says pop comes out, and it destroys the Archon, basically. So in the end of the book, the metaphor is what actually kills the Archon, which I thought was pretty cool.
Grant probably would, if he'd read Tyson Yunkaporta's stuff, have described it that way. But that's his famous thing that, like, both Superman and the Bomb began as ideas. So we should have better ideas, and that's true. I think there's a more haunted way to say it, which is how we're discussing it. But that's his potency, and he at least anchors it into the correct kind of change in the timeline in a way that, as you say, Alan kind of. And I love his stuff. Everyone does. It's not like coming from him in any way, but yes, he's kind of hedging his bets both ways, sort of like Neil Gaiman, so that he can say things that appeal to the more weird amongst his readers, like the one place that gods can be said to inarguably exist is in the human imagination, blah, blah, blah. And that's true, but I mean that differently.
Yeah, exactly. Keep going, please. Yeah. What, how do you mean that differently?
Oh, because we're embedded in the imagination. The imagination isn't embedded in us, right? So that's how you get, like, because he's saying that that's where they inarguably exist in there, whatever. What the rest of that quote is like, real and terrible majesty. I can't remember. And I think that too, but I think we're also in the imagination. I don't think it's in us. So it's a theory of mind challenge. And I agree 100% with his statement. We just have a different theory of mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, basically making the shift to understanding imagination as sort of the original substance. I think I heard this from you, but isn't it thought now that language developed as metaphor first? The thought process being that, Ugg saw fire and said Ugg, and then that meant fire. But it didn't actually work that way. Like the first words were metaphors.
There's no evidence for it, but that's one of the inklings, Owen Barfield's suggestion, that he realized that metaphor describes reality better than non-metaphoric descriptions. And he learned that at Oxford when he was translating. I think it was Cicero's death. And in Latin, when he was translating it, the correct way to translate it into English was Cicero passed out of life. And he realized that, I think it was Cicero, but he realized that is somehow a more accurate way than saying Cicero died. Like he's like, fuck. So the metaphor, which we've been in our kind of linguistic studies, we're told that it's lesser, it's pseudo, it's stuck inside the head. It's not a real thing. It's a thing that makes you think of another real thing. And he's like, I don't know, that's not right. Metaphor comes first. And actually, if you look at ancient languages, and again, Aboriginal languages, Amazonian languages, Aboriginal ones are probably a lot more ancient than Amazonian ones. But it's that kind of famous 300 words for snow or 200 words for rain for Polynesians and so on. Like, you're dealing with, as far as it looks like, we began more nuanced and complete and declined. And interestingly, that would map to the sort of coming closer of a technocratic entity, right? So that
I was about to say that, yep.
Yeah, so you can kind of track that over time, which Grant again plays with, because in one of the ones towards the end, Dane is effectively taken on a tour of where the outer church meets the human imagination by essentially Jesus. Like he doesn't say
Mhm.
that it's Jesus, but he's kind of talking about how these entities erased my true or an accurate representation of my life in 325 AD. So there was a hit on Jesus is kind of what they're saying there. But yeah, that bit I think is really, really useful as a metaphor to understand how you engage combatively with entities like this. So the outer church is the sort of description of the dimension these things come from when it's close to our dimension. And there's this bit where it overlaps with the human imagination. So they're sort of building it in there. And that's absolutely the right way to think about how you begin the process of getting away from the clutches of entities like that. The outer church is being built in the human imagination, and more specifically, they're trying to build the future they want in it. That is like the Great Reset to a T.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and it reminds me of a recent blog post that you did called "How You Play Is What You Win," which, by the way, I think should be tattooed on everybody's arm, because I think that's just one of the most perfect phrases I've ever seen. Can you explain that concept a little bit? What you mean by how you play is what you win? Because I think it ties into what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So, of course, it's brilliant. It's from Ursula Le Guin, right? And it's from... So she was/is effectively a pacifist anarchist and an intellectual anarchist, because anarchism is identical to invisibilism if you get it right, and not the sort of ANCOM LARPing and promotion of state power that is being used by power at the moment, which people associate with it. And anarchism has had 150 years of hits being made on it, because it's the ultimate terror for hierarchical power, and it's also the only one we haven't tried. So what a shock. Anyway. Right. One of the positionings, and this is a sort of Stirner Marx argument in the 19th centuries, is you will end up in the wrong place if you seize state violence to abolish state violence, because you don't actually abolish it, you just want to run it, and that is different. If your goal, and it is an initial leftist goal, to not have state violence, it's like it. Right. So how you play is what you win is a phrase from one of the short stories or novellas in The Found and the Lost. And it is literally about effectively uprisings to overthrow it's like a metaphor for plantation slavery. And so you have the option of letting this system, if you engage with the system violently, you become the plantation owners. And if you don't, if you let it collapse under the by withdrawing from it, by effectively withdrawing or not engaging with it, how you play is what you win. You win non-violence by being non-violent. And that's kind of cosmically true. But it's the trap. Like everyone, this is that myth of significance. And the great tragedy of that is people sort of leave it as like, it is, one, they think myth is the same thing as falsehood. But like the myth of significance is when people, and correctly so, turn around and say, you literally don't need to vote. Like it's this, electionism is a preposterous and primitive idea. That's true, but it's more like misplaced significance. And that's what how you play is what you win shows. Because yes, if you are participating in this idiotic scam, then in the case of the US isn't even going to matter, because Trump's going to win in a landslide on the day, but it's going to be months of pretending all these different fraudulent things have happened, and it'll probably end up, not that I care either way, but we just know what's going to happen. They're already teeing up the lies about what if he doesn't agree to leave, and it's like, well, that's what's going to happen there is you idiots are going to declare that you won even though he did. So he's going to say, well, I'm not going to leave because I won, and you're going to expect the military to remove, like, a mess, right? So enjoy voting in this election, America. God save it. Like, it's going to do fuck all. Do something better that day. Go and have sex. Like, I don't know.
No, voting is a hard pass for me. I didn't vote last time either. I voted for Obama both times because I was, I had hope. you know.
Well,
And
it was
then
on the poster.
and it was on the poster, and you know, I just thought to myself, you know what, this is historic, this is great, and yeah, that pretty much just stomped the last little bit of light out of my eyes. Those two terms, I was like, never fucking again.
Yeah, and as long as you find your correct significance, so like, well, what can I do to make the world better then? That's, you know, politics in the cosmic sense. And this is sort of what James and I spoke about, like the exit thing. Like it is a archonic mess of half-possessed people and just, I don't know, competing with each other because they think they are the ones who should impose cruelty on the planet. Like it's a demon's game, right? So find the correct significance, and that's the sort of how you play is what you win. That's the sort of utopianist, pacifist, anarchist thing. Like, no, the very idea that you have some sort of moral requirement to vote for fucking Kamala Harris and Joe Biden because Trump is bad is just, it's a non-argument, right? It's like, no, I'm not going to vote for a bunch of racist cops. Like, we've already got them. Go and make the world better another way. It's absolutely a non-argument. And that's the kind of thinking that becomes clear in your own heart if you do something like sincerely engage with the invisible. So it's like we're trying to sell it. Like, and that's why.
Hey guys, you can download it too. It's online. I mean, you know, Grant Morrison has plenty of money, but you know, definitely read it for sure. Yeah, because it reminds me of this other this idea of if you want to win, don't play. Basically. And that sounds at first glance like a passive thing to say, but it's actually not. It's very active, because you have to actively not play, because the archonic vacuum sucking vortex, you're like the alien, or like the newborn at the end of Alien Resurrection, the best one, where all of its guts are getting sucked out into space. Like, that's pretty much it. If you let just
back to Twitter.
if you I didn't say Twitter.
No, but I did. Describing Twitter again.
If you let the slightest hole open in that spaceship, it'll suck you out into space, and you'll be right back where it is. So you have to kind of actively fight against that.
Yeah, and
yeah, if you see yourself waking up at 9 a.m. And you're about to say something catty to Roxane Gay on Twitter, you need to go for a run. That's it.
Plant some flowers or something. Like, it needs to be, and again, when the repeated use of the sort of idea that humans are bacteria designed to make it so that these entities can live in our reality, it is that it's not just one side is bad and one side is good. It is the presence of that dialectic that rearranges reality and makes it easier for the archons to make egress, and so it's not where the battle is. You're actually, even if you're on either side, if you want to be blue team or red team in America, you're on the same side as far as I'm concerned.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Literally on the same side, and that's not just about America. It's just you guys have a fraud coming up. It'll be our turn. Assuming they don't suspend them, which they probably will in the next couple of years.
I was going to say, nothing makes my blood run colder than what has been going on in New Zealand and Australia recently. Yeah. The absolute psychopathy of these people. What's the name of the Prime Minister of New Zealand? What's her name?
Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, so there's a video of her. They're giving this, like, this is the archons for anybody who wants to have a perfect real world example of this. But essentially anybody who tests positive for what we're calling COVID-19, which
with a test that will show up as you have it if you either have it or don't have it, because it's an RNA fragment that I can't even tell you about. So, like, the test will either tell you have it or you don't have it, and in both cases, it's a case.
It's a case. Yeah. So if you have a case, you have to now go to a facility. I think I'm getting this right. A kind of quarantine facility. So a camp, a prison, which I'm sure is very nice. I'm sure they feed you 3 square meals a day currently. And the interviewer asks her, upon learning that people have to test negative before they can leave, which might be impossible.
Yeah.
They ask, so if they don't want to take the test, what do they do? And she's all smiles. And she says, well, if they don't want to take the test, then unfortunately they're not going to be allowed to leave. So that might be their incentive to go ahead and take their test or get their jab. And I watched that and I was like, that is the most fucking evil thing I've ever seen in my life. And people look at that and say, oh, good, man, New Zealand is doing the right thing. They really have it taken care of. Are you people fucking insane?
Yeah. Well, at the sort of Davos predatory class planning level, we've always been the test market for this kind of stuff, to see how much people will take. And there's something, again, coming back to the idea that ideas themselves are real. It's we stole this country and made it a police state. So the legal entity that is Australia has always been a police state. This is a prison colony. So that's in the DNA or the cosmic DNA of people who climb the hierarchy here, that this is they become policemen, and that's Victoria for you, right? And they look possessed. She looked possessed when she said that, but if you look at the video of the kind of police violence that's coming out, that's the cruelty of state violence in the eyes of those policemen that are being videoed doing that stuff, and that is one of that entity has always been close to the surface here. And what people don't get about New Zealand was that it actually wasn't a colony initially in the same way, this is imperial nonsense, that Australia was. And it was kind of managed by Australian, which were British soldiers, but like managed by Australian police. Like there were whaling towns that Charles Darwin visited and whatever in the north of New Zealand. But when it became effectively a protectorate, it was essentially a bunch of British soldiers sailed from Australia to kind of sort the place out. So it's kind of been colonized itself by a police state. And that is important. Like this is, again, coming back to like metaphors and story and dreaming in the Aboriginal sense are real things. So if your government has a dreaming of a police state, this is what it looks like when it gets.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love that. That's the first time I've heard it put that way. But yeah, they have police dreaming.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And it's like, to think about the recent video I sent you in the DM, but out of Spain, a woman was going to be arrested for not wearing a mask in public, which we went over earlier, why that's an absurd thing to arrest anybody for. But these 5 cops were trying to take her into custody, and a mob of people essentially yanked her out of their hands and did not use violence. They didn't hurt any of the police officers. They simply stopped them from doing that. So that might be what we're talking about when we talk about actively not playing. Like sometimes you're going to have to do stuff like that, but it's in the interest of stopping that authoritative police violence. I hope to see, hopefully more nonviolent resistance in the US. I'm in Oklahoma, so I'm in a deeply red state that doesn't believe in masks anyway. So hopefully that kind of thing doesn't really get here. But when it does, I don't want to see anybody shot, but I'm just hoping for people like the guy who I see at the gas station, and it's a different guy every time, but he's the same guy, who's just in there, without a mask, just refuses to be in there with a mask on. And he buys his stuff and he goes about his business, just these little acts of rebellion, as much as you can get away with, I think are going to be very important. And also kind of active non-participation is in the creation of new narratives.
Absolutely. So, but right. People need to situate those kind of, because again, centering desire and joy is winning by not playing. And so there are things that when you have to kind of interface with the control grid, there are ways that looks like, and it is the sort of non-violent removal of someone away from police violence. The video you sent from Spain is a really good example. But so Grant literally brings the Marquis de Sade from the past back into the present in the first issue, and he's there in the last one. And the last one's called Invisible Kingdom, which is the idea that the empire never ended. The Invisible Kingdom is this. It's that sort of round table group, technocratic, fire in the minds of men, Carol Quigley, Davos class thing. That's the invisible kingdom, right? So we think, oh, it's the Invisibles, it's a good guy. It is that, but that whole final volume is about essentially installing a demon on the British throne, right? So when he says invisible kingdom, he's referring to this perpetual structure we are talking about that you can't defeat by engaging. You defeat by like desire and joy and orgone. And in that issue, that's like Marquis de Sade's taking my favorite ever character, the person I most want to be in the world, like Lady Edith, through like he's got like pools of orgone energy and all this kind of stuff. I said the Tim Dillon thing earlier, right? Tim Dillon looks like the Marquis de Sade. And I think maybe
he does, yeah.
He looks like Grant Morrison's Marquis de Sade, which is proof that The Invisibles is a documentary because he's exactly that kind of energy.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I love listening to his podcast because you want to talk about somebody who really doesn't have a side at all and who just sort of says what's on his mind. A little plug for the Tim Dillon show. Not that he needs it, but
it's very much his time because this time needs a Marquis de Sade to remind you of like ribaldry and all the rest of it. And it's this masterpiece. And it's almost like he's not familiar with the modern world, like, because I mean his ads are the best thing, right? But like it's almost like he's not familiar with the real world in the same way the Marquis de Sade, when he shows up at the beginning, he's like, I'm gonna like it here, I think, but he's not familiar with it. And it just seemed like The Invisibles continues its spell of being kind of real because Tim Dillon looks like the Marquis de Sade, and I think that is the kind of show that the Marquis de Sade would have if podcast exists when he was writing it.
Well, think about, I mean, he loves food and TikTokers, he's very sort of open about his fascination with Logan Paul and people like that. And he just seems to be a guy who really wants to get out and make people laugh, which really, I mean, comedians, we went through this whole sort of dark period where comedians thought that they were, the truth tellers of the world. It's kind of started with Bill Hicks, and then Jon Stewart put the big old nail in that coffin. When comedy became strictly dunking, that's when you enter into the archonic back and forth, right?
Strictly dunking on corporate Democrat enemies and being paid by the CIA to do it, which is again like Ellen and him and the rest of it.
Right.
Yeah, because it was, and this is why you can't win them by fighting it, because it literally did potentially become a threat to the system, because there were some exciting and vibrant, same thing like Alexei Sayle and whatever in Britain, vibrant middle class, vibrant working class commentary that was hilarious. Richard Pryor, all this kind of thing, very, very dangerous to the system, because it's not just that these entities, and this is one of the ways you do in fact fight back, this is a chaos anarchist thing, these entities demand to be taken very seriously.
Yes.
And
yes,
the
exactly.
thing they hate them because they like cruelty and they can't do life. Anytime you can look at when you point out their absurdities, their funny little hats and their stupid capes, I'm talking about royalty and whatever, but any of them standing up there, taking it seriously, flags and whatever, anything you can do to highlight how ridiculous that is, because that's the spell. That's like the spell of legitimate power. And a working class comedian is the counter spell, right? And so they had to go. And we get and SNL and all those kind of terrible late night shows instead.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of my experience in the world of writing and publishing, because similarly, when you get up the chain, when you go to the correct, dinner parties and meet with the right agents and things like that, that same sort of seriousness kind of seeps in. And then you're given a choice whether you want to play the game that way. And it always felt very wrong to me. It always felt like, well, the reason why I'm doing this in the first place is because I like to have fun. I like to make up weird stories, and then I like for people to read them. And I like to be mostly left alone. But when you get to kind of like the top and, basically every book that is the it book of the season, there are about 6 people who make that decision. Basically the big 5 companies each have a sort of like there are different representatives who go to the different I heard the number 6. I don't know if this is exactly right, but it's kind of this, like, I know this sounds silly, but I think you'll believe me, like a cabal of booksellers, right? So with Amazon and even Barnes and Noble and things like that, and they all sort of pick out which one is going to be their sellers, and often it's, you know, the Snooki's biography or something like that, but they do it with fiction too. They essentially pick out which one, because I'm sure you know this, you know, the Iowa Writers Workshop was a CIA op from the very beginning. So basically the idea was to get everybody to sort of write in this very particular MFA style way that I can smell from a mile away, and I'll put down the book every fucking time. But so it even creeps into the arts, right? When you get high enough up, it becomes this extremely serious business, which is hurting right now because a lot of folks don't read novels. And so they're basically, they've doubled down on, there's a great editor at FSG who's putting out these fantastic, difficult books like Jeff Jackson's Destroy All Monsters, and a bunch of other ones. And he was recently fired because they didn't sell well. And that's against everything that I got into this to do.
Yeah. The art has been weaponized. This is something that I spoke to Dr. Farrell about, and it's in his mind control book, as a Cold War theater of conflict to demonstrate the preeminence of the sort of capitalist system. So they've been, Paris Review was CIA funded, probably still is. And again, it's that same, like, picking the right kind of writers to frame reality in the correct way. And this is the material in Chaos Protocol shows, like, it had come out just as I was writing the book, the interlocking of board membership of the world's biggest companies is like a 66% give or take overlap. What that means in practice is that you can run the world, like, you can set targets on an industry basis for the planet with about 3 or 4 Zoom calls. Like, it is as simple as that. Like, within a week, you can work out what is coming out in fiction, in nonfiction, in cinema, in whatever, in multiple languages around the world, and when, right? And it's literally there at a board board membership level is where you actually see 3 to 5 year strategies being set. And this is the Davos class. This is what I've been talking about. They have the derangement of publishing because they think they're right. They tell you what they're about to do. And 2019 was all about promoting digital currencies and stable coins, so a central bank digital crypto, and going direct. Like, they basically told you exactly what they're going to, and here we are in a world where those things are happening, where you will end up with effectively a central bank crypto wallet very shortly.
And for people who might say, well, what's the problem with that? The issue with UBI, as it's currently being, you know, thought of, is that when you get that money, when you get that digital currency, that's not money that spends just anywhere. That's money that spends in very particular places. Catherine
Fitz calls it, they're replacing currency with credit at the company store. So they're replacing money with gift certificates that you can only use for approved companies, right? And this is also why 5G needs to happen, because you actually, one of the problems that they need to solve in the next few years for things like a crypto is you need the ubiquity of being able to transact for things. So we're all going to be microwaved so they can replace currency with it. So it's a big... Yeah. These things for people who are freaking out, and you kind of get this in The Invisibles. And it's really, really interesting, right? Like, one of the things I loved, and you can tell that Grant's experiences on mushrooms in Nepal and whatever had been similar to mine, in the sense of it really fucks with time. And I'm about to ask you about your tat and novels. But there's a moment where when Dane defeats the King of All Tears in the first one, in Say You Want a Revolution, I think it's in that one. Well, it's in the first volume anyway. What the Archon does isn't die. It kind of expands or unfolds its geometry back into sort of 5 dimensions and finds a point in the timeline where they're weak again and vanishes and goes there. And that's what we're sort of like... when the Davos class publishes what it wants to do, it doesn't mean it's foregone. It just means this is what they want to do.
Right.
and we have the opportunity to arrange our lives for the from a risk management perspective of the parts that we're confident will happen and ones that won't, and so on. So that's the sort of battle, rather than it's all under control. It's not quite like that. Like the Invisibles is a characterization of how you genuinely become this sort of hyperdimensional anarchist chaos magician, right? Like that's the actual it's the manual basically.
Yeah.
But one of the other things we can do, and this is where you talk about your tat, and something else you said which seemed like a stone thought that I'm like, no, I'll probably follow up on that later, is that novels were like good for time travel. So probably do a little bit about how you got into books and so on in various different forms, and then tell us those two bits. And if you want to start with the tat, or if you want to hold on to that, because I presume it has something to do with your idea of time in novels.
Oh yeah, no, that's those are really good questions. I got into books because I was posting short stories on my Zanga. Remember those?
Yes.
So I was posting short stories on my Zanga, and then I found out about this message board. You remember those? Where these people called the Bizarros were exchanging stories back and forth. And so the Bizarro fiction movement started in Portland, Oregon, with a press called Eraserhead, and they're still going to this day. But they had figured out, they had gotten in on Lightning Source really early, which is a print-on-demand service where you can, for a very low cost, not have to print a run of a book. So it kind of frees you from the risk of, a book potentially tanking. So they, with this author, Carlton Mellick III, basically sort of pioneered this hyper strange kind of John Waters meets David Lynch style of writing. They had books called The Haunted Vagina, and what was another really good one? The Menstruating Mall, stuff like that, right? So really strange books. So I fell in with that crew, which is why I eventually moved to Portland. And I had always written stories ever since I was a little kid. My earliest one that my mother has saved is a very clear ripoff of Jurassic Park, except it's in a zoo.
Twinsies.
And
I wrote a sequel to Jurassic Park before Lost World came out when I was in primary school.
Perfect.
And it was, so I would have been 10 maybe, and it was 44 pages, and I'm like, this is a fucking novel. 44 typed pages.
That is good. No, that's great. Yeah, when I wrote this, I was really into Steven Seagal movies as well. So my school had a writing competition that I won with a book called C4 Blowout, which was about a suicide bomber who I think I was watching a lot of GoldenEye at the time and playing a lot of GoldenEye, which I maintain is still the best Bond movie. But
carry on.
But so basically in the book, you'll have to forgive me because I was, I think 11 years old, but it is an Islamic terrorist who commits a suicide bombing in a facility and everybody dies, and that's the end. And so all my classmates voted for that one because I got on pretty well with everybody, and they were just like, yeah, David's the writer guy. But the trick was that they had to read the story at like a parent dinner, and they actually did not read mine. They just said, no, it's good, but we're going to not read that. And so I got high off of that, and ever since then I was like, I'm going to write fucked up shit, and that's how I ended up doing that. So basically, published a few novels on a press that doesn't exist anymore called Swallow Down. The first one's about prisoners in a Russian gulag right after Stalin dies, and it's very, very surreal. But the conceit of it is that they have to escape, but they have to bring someone with them to be what's called a calf, somebody who they eat when they run out of food. So it's basically about camp life. So I read Anne Applebaum's Gulag and Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and like a little vulture, I just took all the nasty bits out and decided to basically turn that into a book. But it's very, very surreal. There's a alien parasite who lives in the protagonist's neck that comes out of his throat while he's asleep and writes novels. So there might be something going on there. I'm not sure. And then towards the end of the novel, he kind of goes into a hallucinatory fugue state where he ends up in a sort of imaginal world where he's part of this marketplace where he sells clothes for placenta, which is something that a lot of, what's the name of the tribe in Siberia that does that? But they'll make little doll clothes for the placenta and keep it for a long time after a child is born. So I got into, and then I started my own publishing company and put out a lot of weird, strange books that have done really well by guys like Stephen Graham Jones and Gabino Iglesias. And I'm kind of rambling here. So that was the question, right? Okay.
No, yeah. Like, how'd you get into books? This is good. You did your books and the press. So carry on, because then we were going to get to why novels and the tat and the reveal there of your crazy stoned idea that probably has some pretty exciting logic behind it.
Yeah. So right. So novels have sort of always appealed to me because of their ability to play with time. I've often said that. Film can do this because film can go back and forward in time. Most films don't take place in real time. Even if it's just over the course of a few days, we're sort of jumping around. But outside of slow motion, what films cannot do is dilate time, which I became really, really fascinated with because I got really in. When I was 18, I read Infinite Jest. It took me like 2 months. And I fell in love with Wallace's, labyrinthine sentences. And the fact that we could still be in a room with a character and it be 40 pages later and we've just gone on a trip together, but we're still in that same room. So the dilation of time, the stretching of time, and also the contracting of time was really interesting to me too, because a film can't contract a book the way something like Mary Robison or Amy Hempel or James Elroy can do, where they can fit everything down into these telegraphic sentences that just give you the straight information that builds this huge picture, right? So I was really interested in the presentation of time through books. Now my tattoo is from The Invisibles. It's on my right forearm. It is of the origami time machine that a scientist named Takashi in the book uses to build a time machine years and years later. And so what I thought was kind of cool about so I see this tattoo as kind of like both a novel and a sort of sigil generator, or more like the powerhouse for these things for me, because in the book, in The Invisibles, the creation of the time machine is a time loop. So the time machine goes back in time and it's seen, and then the guy makes the origami in the shape of the time machine, and that origami shape eventually leads to the time machine itself being made, right? So it's kind of this, it's what Eric Wargo would call a time loop, right? And so the way that I put that on my arm, because whenever you make a sigil or whenever you sit down to write a novel, in a way, usually, well, if you finish it, right, it's already been written or already been completed in the future. The sigil tech that you put on the premium members site, I think it's also in Chaos Protocols, is basically to write out your mission statement as though it already exists.
Yeah.
So the tattoo itself is just sort of like creating this energy, like this feedback between the thing that's already been created and my desire to create it.
Yeah, I like it. The origami time machine that is an origami response to seeing his great-great-grandson's time machine, like in the early 1900s, is the descriptions of him folding it in the garden, like the great-great-grandfather of Takashi, where it's somehow the same thing as the frog jumping in the pond, and also the building of the time machine is another one of those Morrisonisms that has the the exact mouthfeel of something like magic or mushroom chips in particular when they fuck with time, because some of my best ones have been when I've gone to solve things using mushrooms. I actually noticed myself in the past, like the memory of why I was drawn to an empty balcony during a particular incident was because that's where I landed when I was doing mushrooms to come to the moment where the sort of things went wrong in the first place. It's just that kind of galaxy brain fucking moment, right? And there's something about the origami shape, but also the description of it, of the folding of it being like time folding and enfolded time. And and this is real mushroom stuff. Like he's really interested in geometry in a hyperdimensional sense. There's like sort of with Barbalith, there's sort of like a flatland thing of circles and spheres, and a sphere in our dimension would look like a circle and all that kind of stuff. So, and that you notice because mushrooms have that weird, especially when they're coming up, kind of like tesseracting quality. So I love that about I love the characterization of the origami sort of model for the time machine that's also the time machine. It's just perfect.
Yeah, because it has to basically folds itself into the fourth or fifth dimension, and that's how time travel happens. If it does like again, because it's Morrison, it does happen, but it also doesn't, we're kind of left wondering, like, did it just disappear? But of course it did happen because anyway, like then Mason Lang meets, Robin in 2012 or whatever. It's all this, sort of like connecting stuff. I have a question that might seem a little strange, but so I have always had OCD in my life. And when you mentioned being like kind of pulled out onto a balcony, so that can happen to me, but in a way that's a little bit sort of frustrating. That's more like an itch in the brain. I've often chalked that up to mental illness, but is there something weird going on with time? Have I done something?
So one of the best one was sort of like, I can't go into too much detail. It's sort of relationship stuff, but I remember like in the early days of having met James, I was over at his place. We're still obviously living in Auckland. And his bedroom, because we were students, like was the mattress on the floor kind of situation, right? We lived well.
Classic.
And he had the front room of this old house in kind of like one of the real university kind of house in one of the inner suburbs of Auckland. And it had these double doors that opened onto, it wasn't even really a balcony. It was more like a flat. Like I think they were planning to build something there or not, but it was about the size of the double doors, almost like one of those shitty tiny apartment balconies that you can basically just stand on. Like you can't even put a chair or something on it. But it was dangerous because it didn't have barriers or anything. So I kept being drawn to it as I was sort of lying in bed and the windows are open. I said, this is where your aliens land, isn't it? An alien landing platform for you. It's just usual dumb couple teasing stuff. Except when I went looking for a particular healing that I needed in my life. And the mushrooms, like, what do you want me to it was interesting because that was when I started to get good with mushrooms, and you sort of let it into your memories and it's kind of running multi-dimensionally through it. It's okay, cool. And it found it and it took me there. And I was the thing that landed on the balcony watching me and James having this discussion. And then he had these beads that I'd given him that fell on the ground. But like, it was, in my early 20s, when I kept being drawn, my attention kept being drawn to the balcony and saying like, this is where your aliens land. I was being drawn to me going back to that moment to find the medicine that I needed for now, which is where, and it was in that room that the split had happened that needed healing. And that was, I came out of that like, what the fuck? So that's sort of what I mean. Like, I think, and this is what time travel stories can do, right? They can make you realize, which is what The Invisibles is. It's effectively a time travel story. This is kind of you are in a cosmic, and even Battle's too dramatic, but we'll use it. You are in a cosmic exchange if you do it right, on behalf of the forces of life against the forces of anti-life. And And that happens across time and dimensions and so on. But that was like this mushroom moment. It was so weird. And as it was landing, because I mean, I think half the time, like McKenna, I think the mushroom is an alien. So like, I wasn't wrong when I said, oh, is this where your aliens land? But I didn't realize that I was landing with it. And I noticed myself noticing myself, just mind melting.
Yeah, that's wild. I don't even know what to say about that.
Yeah, well, that's.
I mean, it's one of those things. It's one of those things that's so interesting because it makes me wonder. But again, you don't want to get too much into the sort of chemical aspect of what's happening with a mushroom trip. But it's wild that mushroom has the ability to move outside of time, which means that it's basically when you're eating it and what you see could be stuff that's in the future, or like you said, what is it, like letting it into your memory? That's very Invisibles, right? Because again, what they do is they let things in. There's a kind of radical letting poison in. There's a part in Kissing Mr. Quimper where Dane just says, you know what, fuck it, and he walks directly into that goopy hell substance that takes you into the hell realm, right? There's this radical engagement with the poisonous and the evil, right? Not being a part of it, but sort of like allowing it in, not putting up your defenses necessarily, but giving it just enough rope to hang itself with.
Yeah. It became apparent. I mean, I've done a bunch of it, obviously, but it became apparent to me, I think, when we were in the jungle, that I have some entheogenic foo, and that's why I did that show a year or so ago, whenever it was, a solo show about how and why to take mushrooms, because when you engage with it in an animist context of it actually being a person, and not just a person like the real, like something very big in a very small package, you can do things like this. And it has rules. Ayahuasca has different rules, and one of them was like I had to let it into my memories. It will play with you and give you healing through the play and the joy of it. But if you want to take it on a particular ride, or if you want to watch it do its healing, that's the other thing. I've seen it deep down in the unconscious. It was really interesting, like collapsed under the pressure. It was sort of like underwater. I dive in sunken ships and all that kind of stuff, and it was like trying to lift up all these collapsed bits at the very bottom of the almost like where the I had the impression of that Jungian idea that where you have your own unconscious and there is the unconscious, and there's that overlap spot. Really fascinating stuff. I love that kind of thing. But that's a really good example of, again, because we're selling the Invisibles, I guess.
Yes, I think we are.
How being in the world is, if you, again, do it correctly. It's such a dangerous word, correctly. There is a way to be in the world that makes the universe better, and that's being that kind of being on the side of promoting life. In
like a radical way too. Everything from rock music to sex to fashion to sort of like just kind of not following the rules. There is kind of a sort of adolescent sort of punk attitude throughout the entire book, where they're sort of constantly giving people middle fingers, just kind of being like, too cool for school. But that sort of radical engagement with everything that life has to offer, and also being kind of connected to things that are life, like the dirt and the trees, things like going outside with your shoes off and being in the sun. If you have a bad hangover, just go for a walk in the sun. It's amazing. Like, the sun can fix everything. But what I think the Invisibles is kind of doing is that it is a constant sort of battle, might be, again, the wrong word, but like you have to be on your toes. You have to kind of look for power in everything. You have to find out where power is trying to get in, and it can do so very insidiously. And you just sort of have to be against that. It's what you and James were talking about with the Archon. That concept, to me, I haven't read, what is it, Oceanville? How do you say that title? Oymisville, right? Yeah, I haven't read that yet, but the concept seems of sort of radical self-sovereignty, and then kind of expanding out from that, like radical self-sovereignty, and also, being there for your pals when they need it. Just being a radically cool person is kind of a thing.
Yeah, no, I get it. And what I keep telling people is, you actually know this. Like, you know how to do it. It's almost like the Invisibles is just the legitimacy to do it. Like, the right way to be in the world, because a human knows, just in the same way a frog knows how to frog, we know how to human. This attack is to try and make us think we're something we're not. It's that, like, the Archon thinks we're machines. Like, it's trying to fix us as a machine, but we know how to human. And that I think is in there, even if it's, because it's just the most 90s in a good way romp. A lot about it is very 90s, but it will give you the pieces to come to that realization, I think. I guess so here's another question, because it was all written kind of in an end of history sense, sort of post wall coming down, etc., and that kind of slacker 90s era. So there are some parts about, like, war being out of date and so on, that some parts of it haven't aged well. Like, he did his best, but like some of the gender stuff with Fanny's a bit out of date. And,
oh, dude, Jim Crow is very problematic.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it's possible to cancel this book, but like, there are some bits in there that that do not survive closer reading in 2020. And calling your black character, who's also half Papagere, Jim Crow.
That was a little rough. But again, it comes down to the fundamental problem with canceling. Canceling is essentially applying managerial principles to art, and saying that there is a list of things that are proper and improper. When you go into this workplace, you have to wear a suit and you are not allowed to swear. Also, you have to be a completely sort of sexless drone bot. That seeped in the way that the Archon, who has like the Archon juice coming out of her nipples, and when the guy drinks the Archon milk,
Miss Dwyer.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, he can feel the little bugs going to work on his suit. It's like those little bugs, right? Once you start, kind of sucking from the tit of the Archon, it bleeds out, and you want to start putting it other places. Like, you become a vector. Like, this is the only case where virology actually works. You become a vector for this sort of archonic, rules-based system that just really doesn't make sense when you try to apply it to a thing like art. Because The Invisibles is one of the purest works of art that I've ever encountered, right? And in that, I think that it's so against everything that canceling stands for that I do think it's uncancelable.
I think so. I don't think you can cancel life, which is also why they fail. But it reminded me, because there's some bits that are very 90s, but there are some bits that are like alarmingly prophetic even by his standards. And it reminded me, when you were using the Mr. Dwyer example, that Colonel Friday, who's the other kind of Archon villain from the beginning, I'm going to read from page 98 of Bloody Hell in America, because just pick which year, dear listener, this sounds like. Hear this: when our master's work is done, every living thing will have the status of a machine. There will be no creativity, only productivity. Instead of love, there will be fear and distrust. Instead of surrender, there will be submission. We will replace contact with isolation and joy with shame. Hope will cease to exist as a concept. We will cover the earth with steel and with concrete. This planet will be a factory farm producing morons to fuel and maintain the factory engines and feed our masters. There will be an electronic policeman in every head. Your children will be born in chains, live only to serve and die in anguish and ignorance. Look around you. The process is already in its final stages.
Yeah, damn. God,
like, what fucking year is he talking about? He's literally basically says contact tracing, and you will all be put in isolation. And that's right. Why when this happened, I'm like, I know this bitch. I know this. I know this entity as it came close. And one of the things that, when you realize that, there's this. Fanny has all the best lines, I think. But there's a bit where she says to Mr. Quimper, like, I remember you from the forest. You're a small little spirit. I know what you are. The forest was filled with little spirits like you. These entities are spirits and jumped up ones at the moment because they've certainly stolen a march on us. But that's a really good point. But one of the problematic, cancelable things in there is that she's somehow Brazilian, but her grandmother is like a Mazatec or Maya shaman, and it's sort of like she's in the Mexican underworld, but she's like a Brazilian trans.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like some of the words are a bit clunky, but it's also you are talking about. We get where he's going, and weirdly, it's I don't know if he knows this, but I think it's an excellent depiction of kind of like Mexican witchcraft in the Mexican underworld, rather than anything that you'd see in like candomblé or something in Brazil. Like it's actually quite good curanderismo, but make it metal. And so when Fanny's like, I know what you are, the forest was filled with little spirits like you, it's another way to remember that they are little spirits, like the universe is alive, and there's hope.
Yeah, and at the end, you do find out that the archons themselves are kind of this this sort of sloughing off, like a scab coming off of the universe's constant birthing, right? So the placental break off from our world comes in two forms. It's the archons, and then there's Barbalith, right? And Barbalith, like they're both byproducts of this thing. And when you realize that it's just sort of a byproduct, like, when you pick a scab off or something, I think treating them as small is good for the mental, and also good for, it's actually just good praxis. Dare I use that word? But it's I mean, like they don't want to be, I mean, they all have Napoleon complexes, right? Like Fauci is literally 4 feet tall. Okay. Yep. So, I mean, these people are small in stature and in spirit, and they're those little forest spirits that hitched a ride on the train to the dark side because they thought they could get something out of it, and you just have to not let them.
Yeah, I like it. Anything else we want to say? We hit the 2-hour mark. Any other questions on your half of the Swapcast?
No, this has been such a privilege. I have found so much value while we're trying to sell the Invisibles. I'm gonna maybe embarrass you a little bit, but I signed up for the premium membership in its early stages, and I went through each class as they came, and I'm the kind of person who forgets a lot of details of things, but I think I'm good at remembering the gist of stuff. And so with each particular class, I felt an actual positive change in my life every single time, including the controversial wealth class. But that was rough for some people. It was the idea of like, you won't get cooties from engaging with certain thinkers and things, but that was big for me too. That was the last little puzzle piece that I needed in this whole thing, of the idea of like, okay, I'm not going to get sick by engaging with ideas that I don't agree with. So I thought that was important. But anyway, my big point is that I just love what you're doing, and this has been one of the cool things. Everybody's been having a shitty 2020, but mine's pretty good now. So thank you.
Oh, shucks. And your new, well, give both podcasts and where people can find your books and so on, but you've got a new project that's making 2020 a little bit better too. So give us that.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no, so my show is the JDO show, which is an interview series with writers who are also my friends. Back in the past, I did interviews with, I did the whole thing, emailing their agent, and then I would interview them about their book, and it was so bloodless. And I don't know if you've ever had a guest who just won't give you anything. Like there's nothing worse than a guest that just answers your question, that just says yes or no. So I decided to, talk to other people. You're going to say something?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what that is. And even when they don't realize it. So Rupert Sheldrake did that. And I think it's because he wasn't that, he's so used to some of his lines, like he has, and they're great. Like he's got them honed. So panpsychism and is the sun conscious and all those lines about how, and they're so good at breaking people out of thinking materialistically. But he was one where it was kind of like, you're just saying the lines. And I think it's because he wasn't as, which is surprising, wasn't as au fait with podcasts, because he's got a really good conversation series with Mark Vernon going at the moment where that doesn't happen. So, but I know exactly what you mean. That's why I wanted to ask you about the new project, which you can tell me about in a minute. But the reason I've kind of been doing Swapcasts and solo shows is, one, I need to get some information out to people before the space weather at the end of this month, and the chaos that the US in particular is about to go through with however this shakes out, and whatever your opinion of it is, an attempted coup. Like, you are living through that. And so I want to give people things like The Invisibles, and I want to return to them the idea that if you do conspiracy right, it is being aware of acting in class interests. Like, it's a legitimate left critique because you're about to see it, right? So I'm not really sure when I can... it hasn't felt right to be like, oh, let's do a tarot episode now. But I think it's funny. I think I need to put the material out in advance of it. And then when it's happening, I think that's what I need to do. Like shows on tarot and whatever, journeying and entheogens and all the kind of like usual suspects. But it hasn't felt right now because 2020 has been, from a creative perspective, difficult to navigate, as I'm sure you would agree. But as one, I'm going to ask you if you're bullish about novels in this moment, and two, tell us about the second podcast, because I've only listened to, how many are out? I listened to the first one. I loved it.
Two. We're actually going to record. We're gonna record our next episode actually right after I get off this call. So we'll have 3 out around the same time that this drops. So that podcast is called No Country. I do it with a writer named Chris Saknussemm, who is just a fascinating guy. I met him because he blurbed my first novel, and he's a person from the old school of writing. He's in his 60s now. His first novel was called Zanesville, and when it came out, people thought that he was a pseudonym for David Foster Wallace, and then other people thought that he was a collective of writers because they couldn't conceive that one person had written this just, dense, kaleidoscopic sci-fi fantasy. It's very Invisible-ish, actually. There's a little plug there. Novel. And then he and I became friends at a convention, and we talk on the phone all the time. And he has this amazing past where he was born in the Bay Area, and then he moved to the Solomon Islands for a time, and sort of engaged with the people there because he was shooting pictures for National Geographic. And he has a conception of magic that is informed by the shamans of the tribe that he was in, because he was sort of given the white guy initiation, which, whatever that is, right? But he sort of understands magic from a perspective that you and I would recognize. And he's also somebody who just, he's been to jail. He's done all sorts of things that I cannot say on a podcast because I don't know what the statutes of limitations are, but a fascinating sort of super secret agent type guy. And so our podcast is me talking to him about things like place and our current moment, and how to feel like you have a home when you don't feel like you have a home. Because we called it No Country because we both feel very sort of out of place. And I just moved back to Oklahoma, and I'm becoming sort of embedded in this world where I feel very comfortable. And so I'm kind of in this great state for this podcast where I can articulate why I felt so out of place in places like Portland and El Paso, and why this particular place works for me, and then him too, So it's mostly a discussion of place. Now, as far as novels, I think that novels are definitely going to be big in the next 10 years. I just don't think that the current Big Five model is going to be the way that they're big.
I think culturally big, because it even if you get the CIA to print them, you still have the opportunity to have a it's funny, they're analog now again. Like, I think the fact that it's a real object in most cases is important, but I think we've reached that moment, kind of we were talking about before about blogging and writing. I think we've reached the great promise of self and indie publishing. And when I say great promise, it's because we fucking need it now. If you look at not just it's almost wrong to look at what the big five as a model in an industry is doing. It's to look at everything else and go, movies are shit, TV is shit, like all this other, it's all shit. Comics have collapsed. Comics have collapsed because, I mean, I don't read them, but apparently there's a whole go woke, go broke thing going on with them. So where does the genuine impulse, a countercultural impulse, come from? And that's why I think things like novels, even if you get the CIA to print them, I think it's an opportunity to have independent voice in there somewhere.
Right, because again, if you're buying the physical book, it is analog, and there is something there's something that the perfume nationalist said on Twitter. Are you familiar with this guy?
Oh, you asked if I listened to his episode with Thaddeus of Unregistered, and I did. I listened to that, so now I am familiar with him. Yeah.
So this guy, he's a wildcat. Check it out if you want to. It's choppy waters, but he said something that really resonated with me, which was most of the time the best novel reading experiences of my life, I was bored at times, and I've been going through the My Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgaard, and it is very boring, but it's also very addictive. So I think that introducing a little bit of like analog things that require a commitment, that require the engagement of your imagination, and also at times a little bit of boredom, I think people are going to start gravitating towards that once they recognize that boredom. I'm not talking about like silly meditation stuff or whatever, but like actual boredom and investment creates its own reward that's outside of the constant dopamine rush.
Yeah, I like that's really interesting. If the novel in Jane Austen's day was electrifying because it was a high technology object, right? It would trigger the dopamine, even her terrible books, right? Like, but it was electrifying. It's kind of like, it is an 18th century technology or 19th, if you're fair, in many respects. And so it's interesting that its value now is that it is it was almost like a retraining of the mind, because it trained it in an electrifying way. It was the Twitter of its day, like because this is printing in general, but like a novel was a blockbuster, and now it's something. This is what I mean. I feel like the novel has come to save us again.
I think so too. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it's just this kind of reverse thing. And I think that a lot of writers who I interact with are still stuck on this idea that they're going to be Stephen King, and they're going to live that kind of, the rock star life of the paperback pulp dudes of the, 60s, 70s, 80s, which actually they're looking at through slightly rose-colored glasses, because I don't think people like Philip Dick had a great time back then. But I think that if authors in particular, to anybody out there who's listening who's a writer, I think if you sort of retrain it to think of yourself as doing an act of magic, I think it works a lot better. And I think that if you think of it as pretentious as this might sound, but as something that is in its own way kind of saving the world, you're doing that much more than you are by, dunking on Ben Shapiro on Twitter, 100%.
Absolutely. Speaking of books then, so those are the two shows. This will all be in the show notes, of course. Where else can people find you, your books, other stuff you want to get out there?
Yeah, so on Twitter, I am at BRB, like be right back, BRB JDO. I'm pretty active on Twitter, even though I try not to be. I try not to be before a certain time of day, but I'm on there. The books... my book, the one that I talked about earlier, is called By the Time We Leave Here, We'll Be Friends, which I used to think it was cool to give my books really long titles. Another one's called Black Gum. and then another one's called A Minor Storm. And those are cool. Those are fictionalized accounts of my times in Oklahoma with a kind of made up character who's a sort of redneck dowser shaman type guy. And so I really tried to kind of weave in, Oklahoma mythology and make a system of magic that makes sense in that book for, people who also like NASCAR and beer. And then Broken River is the book company, but unfortunately, to my great shame, if you go to that website, it says under construction because I'm lazy. But there's like 40 books. I'll get that up eventually. So, I know people listen to these months and months later. So
that's true.
I'll get up and do it. And you, sir, where can people find you? What books should they buy? I have my own favorites, but I'll let you do it.
You can get everything from runesoup.com. I'm also still on Twitter, mostly just to DM with you at this stage.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I can't quit now.
Yeah,
or else Gordon will fucking start to spiral.
I was thinking about it as I was preparing for the show. I'm like, my spiciest DM rooms, like not necessarily bitchiest, but spiciest, are all with like straight men, either in a group or like you. Like I'm looking down my list of DMs, like, going, God, the bitchiest people I know is straight men. It's weird to me. I love my DM.
Yeah, man.
We're bitchy though. We're just spicy and right. That's important.
Yes,
yeah.
Extremely correct. A lot of us is crowing about being correct.
Yeah, so
something that
don't experience FOMO. It's not actually a good DM room to be in.
Unless you're us.
Yeah, exactly. Runesoup.com. Again, I'm on Twitter, Gordon_White, WHATE. And you can navigate to the books from runesoup.com. Probably, if you want to do magic, then you buy 2 of them. You get Chaos Protocols and Pieces of 8. If you want to know why you should do magic and how the universe is magical, Starships is a place to start. So for people who listen to a show that's kind of like about books, my most booky book is Starships so far.
Excellent. All right. Well, hey, thanks again.
Yeah, it was fun.